Welcome to the reading of the Sabbath School lesson for the second quarter of 2022. Welcome to lesson number 8 in the series on Genesis. It's titled The Promise, ready for teaching on May 21, and I'm Percy Harrold. Friday, May 20. Because Abraham was the extraordinary prophet with whom God would share his plans, Genesis 18:17 says, "And the Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing?" God entered Abraham's human sphere and shared with him to some degree his plan of salvation through the sacrifice of his son. Ellen White writes in Testimonies for the Church, Volume 3, page 369, Isaac was a figure of the Son of God who was offered a sacrifice for the sins of the world. God would impress upon Abraham the gospel of salvation to man. In order to do this, and make the truth a reality to him as well as to test his faith, he required him to slay his darling Isaac. All the sorrow and agony that Abraham endured through that dark and fearful trial were for the purpose of deeply impressing upon his understanding the plan of redemption for fallen man. He was made to understand in his own experience how unutterable was the self-denial of the infinite God in giving his own Son to die to rescue man from utter ruin. To Abraham, no mental torture could be equal to that which he endured in obeying the divine command to sacrifice his son. End of quote. And from the same author, Patriarchs and Prophets, page 171. Abraham had become an old man and expected soon to die. Yet one act remained for him to do in securing the fulfillment of the promise to his posterity. Isaac was the one divinely appointed to succeed him as the keeper of the law of God and the father of the chosen people, but he was yet unmarried. The inhabitants of Canaan were given to idolatry, and God had forbidden intermarriage between his people and them, knowing that such marriages would lead to apostasy. The patriarch feared the effect of the corrupting influences surrounding his son. In the mind of Abraham, the choice of a wife for his son was a matter of grave importance. He was anxious to have him marry one who would not lead him from God. Isaac, trusting to his father's wisdom and affection, was satisfied to commit the matter to him, believing also that God himself would direct in the choice made. End of quote. And that brings us to our two discussion questions for this week. 1. In class, talk about Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac. Try to imagine the kind of faith that this account reveals. What is so astonishing and yet at the same time troubling about this story? 2. What about free will? Why does our faith make no sense without it being a reality? What examples do we have in the Bible of free will, and how, despite the wrong choices people make, God's will ultimately is accomplished? Inside Story. Our mission story this week is titled Two Divine Appointments, and it's by Theda Pienaar. I have a habit of not travelling without first asking God whether the trip would be his will. I live in Ireland, while my family lives in South Africa and a sister lives in Namibia. I visit them about once a year. On the airplane, I read the Bible, Ellen White books, and the Adult Sabbath School Bible Study Guide. I also always take Steps to Christ in my bag. The books shorten the trip and lead to interesting contacts. Every time I travel, something interesting happens. One time I started talking with the man seated next to me while waiting for our flight at the airport in Dublin, Ireland. It turned out that he worked as a special detective for the Irish police force and travelled home to see his family in Cape Town, South Africa, every 2 to 3 months. We chatted about life while waiting for our turn to board the plane. On the plane, a young woman sat beside me and immediately began speaking. "I arrived late at the airport and just made the plane," she said. "I am so stressed." "God knew that you need to catch this plane," I said. I spoke about how God takes charge of our lives when we allow him. Just before takeoff, the flight attendant told the young woman that she had taken the wrong seat. She left, and who should sit beside me but the policeman? "Isn't this interesting?" I said. "I believe God does things for a reason." "You believe in God?" the man asked. He asked about my religious background, and I said I am a Seventh-day Adventist. "Isn't that strange?" he said. "My wife has been trying to convert me for many years. She is a Seventh-day Adventist." "I am thrilled to meet you," I said, and I was. We spoke about salvation, and I gave him a copy of Steps to Christ. "My wife has been trying to get me to read this," he said. "Now I will read it." My 2 encounters were so remarkable. The ice was broken with the police detective before we boarded the plane. I also was able to mention God to the woman who sat in the wrong seat. Ireland is a very secular country, and it is not easy to speak to people about Christianity. But God provided 2 opportunities before the plane even left the ground. This mission story illustrates the following components of the Seventh-day Adventist Church's I Will Go strategic plan. Mission objective number 2, to strengthen and diversify Adventist outreach in large cities and among unreached and underreached people groups. Spiritual growth objective number 5, to disciple individuals and families into spirit-filled lives, and the Holy Spirit objective, to be defined as the Holy Spirit leads. Read more about this in iwillgo2020.org. This lesson was read by Dr. Percy Harrold for Christian Services for the Blind. Sponsored by the Sabbath School Department and distributed through Hope Channel Australia, this podcast is also redistributed by Hope Channel Germany, Christian Record Services for the Blind, and It Is Written. It is also available on SoundCloud and through multiple podcast distributors, including Apple iTunes. Remember, God is always faithful.